Hello, I'm Bryan Johnson. Welcome to Viewpoint on the News. My guest today is Sergeant Charles Pillon, Chuck, or Charlie. Some even called him Dirty Harry, and that's a reputation that came about as a result of a lot of drug activity in the South End. And I don't think they mean Dirty Harry critically, Chuck, but there's somebody who just hits and runs on drugs. Was it your strategy, or what happened in the South End that made you an instant celebrity?
Well, I think a situation got out of hand, created a need. Several of us, not just me, reacted to that need, trying to do two things: deal with the problem on the streets and develop an alternative for the police department so that there could be a more consistent attack throughout the areas that have this kind of trouble in this town.
You're talking about pot, you're talking about cocaine. What got out of hand?
Well, the phenomenon that's made these problems most serious in the inner city is the emergence of crack cocaine. The background drugs, the marijuana, shake cocaine, which is used by the yuppies and others, and then heroin, of course, we're always there. But the emergence of crack cocaine is the thing that created this flood. It's an avalanche.
Okay, tell me what happened. For anybody who has not followed crack cocaine, what is it? How prevalent is it?
Well, cocaine, first of all, was expensive years ago, and that limited usage. The mode of usage was rather one-dimensional, snorting and like that, and the potential high wasn't very often realized in snorted cocaine. We are well aware that the flood of drugs of all kinds that came into this country in the late 70s again created an avalanche of supply and drop price cocaine, and then American ingenuity took over at the same time, and the emergence of the crack form, which is a pure crystalline form of cocaine, which can be melted and inhaled. They call it smoking, but actually they're just vaporizing it. Creates an incredible and sudden addiction and a population of addicts that's just proliferated in these cities, and so the problem is there.
You were assigned to South Seattle,
right.
Rainier Valley, Beacon Hill area.
Right.
How prevalent is it?
Well, let's say by comparison that in the 70s, if we had a dozen heroin outlets from all of McClellan Street south and Beacon Hill east to Lake Washington, in all of that region of about 100 or so thousand citizens, we thought we had a serious heroin problem. When crack cocaine arrived, we suddenly found that in some apartment complexes we had 5, 6, 8, 10 outlets for crack cocaine. And at a point in time when the situation was most out of control and the police profile was lowest, we probably had 50 to 70 outlets in that same area where previously we'd suffered 10 and thought we had a real problem of drug outlets, where the dope was trafficked and the stolen property and the guns and all that were taken in trade.
If you're talking about 50, perhaps more, places where rock or crack cocaine can be purchased, and as I understand, it's a very easy operation to set up. They could be all over that area. Is there any way that 2 or 3 police officers can deal with that?
No, and I think what that underscores is the fact that neither could the 8 working narcotics detectives from the central precinct, which had the whole city as their responsibility, ever hope to cope with it. And when we began our inroads, we were in touch with them. There is a strong sense of a working relationship that doesn't receive the publicity it should.
Okay, let me take you back to January of last year. You and some others in the South Precinct said, we have a problem.
Right.
We want to do something about it.
Right.
What did you propose?
We proposed on the 6th of that January a joint task force to operate between the East Precinct and the South Precinct with the idea of targeting these locations, learning where they were, taking the information of the proper targets to narcotics, and then using the patrol presence to suppress so much of the activity which narcotics could just never get to.
Now, the way I heard of you was that there is going to be a raid, sources tell me, on a crack cocaine house. It's going to happen at X hour of the morning. Why don't you show up and see what happens? And here, all of a sudden, going in, Chuck Pillon and his troop, and coming out, TV sets, VCRs, jewelry, guns, all sorts of equipment. What were you doing at that point?
Attempting, and understand by then, we had developed a certain sense of frustration with the department, not moving fast enough and effectively still trying to deny the problem. We figured that the only way the public was going to awaken and make the demands, which have begun to surface, was if they really saw the magnitude of this problem. And so, yes, we did make indications of the sorts of hauls that could be expected, and the media did show up on some occasions.
What were you doing? Were you going in there saying, we are going to bust them, we're going to rush in with guns blazing, we're going to arrest everybody in sight? Or what was your game plan?
Well, this gets to one of the really pivotal considerations in this whole thing for the public to understand. It has been portrayed that all we could do was go up and hammer on doors, and I think you saw a case where we did that one time. What people have to understand is that we employed those tactics only after we had taken these targets to narcotics, and in many cases they tried 2, 3, 4 times to get an informant in or to make a buy with the street team. And when they could not do the traditional thing, typically what they did was then leave the problem in the neighborhood to suffer it. What we did then was say that if the traditional means fail, we will now employ this suppressive effort on the part of the patrol division.
What's a suppressive effort?
Simply, it's this. You recognize that you have serial, ongoing criminal activity in a location, and it is not vulnerable to the traditional police strategy. So then you simply go right down their throats. We're in these uniforms, go up and hammer on their doors, call them out, ask for the tenant of record, ask for any person that can even name that tenant of record, or the owner if it's a privately owned residence, and demand an explanation in the terms that the neighbors have related, constant traffic, they've seen guns displayed, they've seen TVs and VCRs and things going in. And the courts have never held that we can't confront people and initiate conversation like that.
You're telling me that what you would do is look in the South End, you'd get a lot of complaints from neighbors, you
Right.
get the address of a house, you run over to narcotics and say, can you do something about this?
Exactly.
And they'd say, hey, we can't get in there.
That's
you know,
right.
Chuck, we're too busy. We're only 8 people. That's a small operation. And at that point, you just walk up there and go wham, wham, wham on the door.
Precisely.
Would you have a search warrant?
In some cases, we wrote search warrants of our own. What we were determined to do when all else failed was something. And that's what was so valuable to the community. They realized that the cops would be that determined and do those things in a proper fashion.
So you'd literally go up to the door and say, I am Sergeant Chuck Pillon.
Right.
Or Charlie, or however you referred to yourself.
Right.
Can I come in?
Exactly.
And then you'd go in.
Yes.
Because most people wouldn't say, no, you can't come in.
You're right. They will not in most cases.
And once you go in there, you start hauling stuff out.
There are some preliminary things you have to do. Once you're in a place to discuss a problem, which is proper, you have got to measure what you see there. Let's say you see crooks that you know have been armed in the past or guilty of assaults and like that. Then you make a second inquiry. Is anyone here packing a gun? Are there any guns in the place? And you would ask, if you can find the tenant of record, for an opportunity to look around to see who else may be hiding. You'd hear doors closing and closet doors vibrating and like that. And there is a proper step-by-step means that the police can use to unscramble these situations and see what's there that should be properly of concern to the police.
Now, you go back into a back room.
Yes.
And I've been with you on some of these things, and you'd see 5 television sets stacked on top of each other.
Exactly.
And you'd see 3 videotape recorders sitting off in a corner. I understand you said, does anybody own these?
Yes, exactly. We would inquire. In the context of what a reasonable man would conclude, when you know there's drug trafficking and you know the neighbors are seeing these things packed in the nighttime, it's a reasonable indicator that these things are probably stolen property. You would simply make that inquiry. Again, you corner the tenant. You say, look, is this stuff yours or didn't so-and-so bring it in here? And it helps to know your players. You can practically quote who would be running that kind of loot. They would say, hey, I don't know about this stuff. It was brought in here by these fools about this cocaine and like that. And I would say to them, look, I'm certain that this stuff is stolen. What I want to do is take it. I will account for it on a police report. It will be in the SPD evidence room, and we will begin to track it, and I'll let you know. Now, there's an element of trust that we developed, an element of understanding that if the traditional means had failed and we did this, there would be fair play. We wouldn't double back trying to make a flim-flam case on people if they had surrendered these things to us.
One of the things that this did was move rock houses around. It would force people out of areas that had closed down a neighborhood problem. The police chief came along and said, Officer Pillon is not operating within traditional methods. He's engaging in harassment. We are not getting cocaine arrests. And I'd like to ask you, why, in heaven's name, should anybody support just moving people around rather than going after arrests? We'll discuss that when Viewpoint on the News returns. My guest is Sergeant Chuck Pillon. So far, we've discussed the fact that there is a rock cocaine problem in the city of Seattle. The number 2, the narcotics unit, has been largely unable to suppress it. And number 3, Chuck Pillon stirred up a storm by saying we're going to try non-traditional methods. We're going to go in, We're going to take the stolen property away, put it down in the police property room, and we're going to shove a police presence in there and shove those people right out. Right. Now, some people say all you're doing is playing a little game like switching light bulbs from one room to another. All you're doing is pushing people around. Police shouldn't do things like that. Police should arrest.
Well, clearly what you have is a little bit of fact and a little bit of fiction that was used to portray and discredit us. What the chief of police has not told this community, and he knows the cases, and the people in narcotics would identify them, are the countless times when we took the narcotics unit or the street team to these places. And in traditional terms, if they could make the buy, do the warrant, and all like that, we did those things jointly. What we did then in this suppressive effort was, as I said before, go beyond that. So when he says, all I'm doing, go ask those neighbors if they didn't appreciate that fact that if the traditional means failed, we took the exceptional means. And if each time you move these people, you get their guns and you get their stolen property and they have to flush their drugs, slowly their ability to do business is diminished and the impact on the community is lessened. And if the alternative, once the traditional means have failed, and this was the way we practiced in this town, is simply to leave them then and leave them to tear these neighborhoods apart, I submit, and that's been the groundswell of public support, that you go out in those neighborhoods and those people want more done. That's what we did.
Now, you told me one time you could take me out to the South End to a great number of streets and say, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there.
That's right.
Did you go up to each door, bang on each door, and try and get in? How did you select your targets?
Virtually every one. What we did, and the clerks at the South Precinct would attest to this, we got 40 and 50 calls a day at that precinct, Dwayne Brown and I, when we were the team, from neighbors identifying. Once they had a sense of what we were trying to do, our informants would confirm and kind of cross-corroborate this stuff, and narcotics would send us lists when they got complaints. Then we would consult with narcotics and with the street team, and we're proud of a lot of the arrests they made because we helped set the stage for them. As I said, then, if we had a comprehensive list and knew virtually every place it was operating, those that could be done by narcotics were done, and yes, we tried to attack every other one. But the notion wasn't that just a few of us would do this. It was that over time, every patrol supervisor and every patrol squad for the whole 24 hours of the day would understand this need and this way of attacking this problem.
In other words, what you were saying is that the way to control drugs is to have every police officer
Absolutely.
who knows that something is happening out there pounding on doors and making the life of the pushers hell.
Absolutely. And this was identified in a plan that Patrick Fitzsimons saw and tentatively approved through his chain of command as the necessary kind of missing link as we portrayed it. That plan was presented prior to last May by Romero Umel, the captain of the South Precinct, essentially was blessed and the practice was put into effect. Then in the end, when we began to develop the groundswell of support from the community and frankly to upstage the traditional effort, the house of cards came tumbling down on us. It was suggested that these were improper methods that hadn't been
You're saying
assessed.
that Chief Fitzsimons literally approved this plan?
Absolutely.
On a piece of paper?
Absolutely. Romero Umel has the documents, and he's the captain of that precinct.
Why then deny it?
I think it goes to the embarrassment that we created. If you look at the history of this town in recent years and the lack of effort against organized criminal activity, especially narcotics, and...
Wait a minute, stop.
All right.
It's easy to make a statement like, they were ignored for years.
Absolutely.
What do you mean? How did Seattle ignore organized crime? Can you prove that?
Absolutely. Let's consider an example in the 4500 block of 35th South, which was the first rock house we did on the 27th of October of '85. The neighbors there came to the streets when we were there out in our cop cars taking this place apart in tears and told us how they had called the mayor, the chief of police, the clerk at the precinct, 911, the DEA, the FBI, and again, all those people, and multiple times, for 13 solid months, only to be told, well, we can't get an informant in there, so we can't do anything. In that afternoon, in a 2.5-hour time frame, we took $440 through the door ourselves. We were imitating the crooks from behind a windowless door, and $440, 16 or 17 different contacts came in there. This and countless other scenarios were simply allowed to go in this town. And this town has got to ask, why was that acceptable? Why was
tell me why. I mean, you were inside the police department. You were among those working that area,
right,
who heard the complaints of neighborhood. You must have talked to your captain. You may have taken it all the way to the chief. You may have talked to DEA. You said, we ignored it.
Yes. You have to have a sense of history about all of this. In the 70s, many of us in patrol fought this same battle, identified the problem in the same way, and we have the documents. And the brass finally agreed with us. Undoubtedly, the community would be better served if we did as you in patrol suggested. When Fitzsimons came here, some quiet overtures were made. We tried to develop a sense of how he might go against these things. And very quickly he announced to the detectives in the follow-up units that he wanted a minimal sort of attack on this problem if it meant consequences for him in the form of lawsuits or protests from the public in the inner city. So the stage was set for less and less of this kind of thing to be done. The narcotics unit was attrited by a full squad from 3 to 2 at about that same time. I think nothing emphasizes the fact that all these things were in disarray better than if you will recall that a major local newspaper in October of 1985 featured a story on the disrepute that the Seattle Police Department narcotics squad and effort in general had fallen into in regional terms. All of the detectives that were interviewed from surrounding agencies and DEA like that said the Seattle Who, they literally were that concerned that we had just fallen from our place in the sky.
You're not saying it was protected. You're not saying that there was some sort of protection system that operated that kept these houses going?
No, I have never seen an indicator that there was corruption in that sense. And sadly, that would have been more easy to deal with. We could have gone to the right authorities and said there's obviously a payoff system or something like that. It was a chosen strategy which minimized certain people's political risks. I submit that that has surfaced as a...
It was a case of CYA for the chief.
That's right.
What would have been the political consequences of going out there and knocking off a few rock houses?
Well, more to the point, look at the tremendous rewards that the public groundswell of support that we have generated in doing exactly that thing. It was a miscalculation. They simply sensed that they should let the sleeping dog lie. But it reached what I call critical mass. There came a time when the community just wouldn't tolerate it anymore.
I suppose that if I were running a police department and I knew that there was a certain way to get arrests, and that meant buys, and I couldn't get enough buy money out of the city council, I had state law which didn't allow me to have an officer with a wire or a bug on him. I couldn't tap a telephone without a court order, that I might be a little bit frustrated too, but somewhat reluctant just to send police officers up knocking on doors, because there have been a lot of stories in this city about police just showing up knocking on doors, and it reminds some people of a police state. Why do you think it was appropriate to just go out and knock on doors?
I think you have to go back to the fact that there was a plan that was defined, that was considered with the legal advisor. Mr. Fred Treadwell came to our precinct and discussed scenarios we had done. We reached a point where there were indicators in law that exist, how the police should proceed, and what was necessary in order to prevent abuses. Careful documenting of the visits we made, and a clear indicator that we'd never try to trump up a charge if we did come onto some good evidence that way. It is more difficult for the police to do these things, but the rewards for the community and for the police in terms of morale and like that are obvious. And finally, it's an imperative. It has to be done.
One obvious question comes out of this. If your squad, operating for a period of time, was able to close down a number of rock houses, did it make any real difference in cocaine traffic in the region you served, or did it just move it around inside that district so you had another door to knock on the next day? And I'll let you respond to that when Viewpoint on the News returns. My guest is Sergeant Chuck Pillon. Chuck, we left with a question hanging in the air, and that is, sure, you were able to take some money away from some people who were pushing crack or rock by swiping the VCRs they might have offloaded to a fence, the jewelry they might have offloaded. But did you really make a dent in the operation of such houses in the South End? Is there anything you can point to?
I think one of the best indicators, we reduced the amount of collateral crime. It is unheard of in these cities, for instance, to reduce a burglary rate in a given area. But in that greater Rainier Valley area, in the time frame when we were really hammering at these people, we reduced burglary, residential burglary, by about 15%. At a point in time when the rate for the city in general was climbing about 15 to 18%, and in the east central areas of the city where the rock house phenomenon was also proliferating, they went up over 100% in that same time, over 100%. There is a displacement factor. What we argued from the get-go and identified in our plan was that in time, as I said before, the whole patrol force would have to recognize its role in this suppressive effort. Then one day there is no sanctuary.
In other words, if Chuck Pillon and Brown and a few others are making life very difficult for the crack dealers in the South End, and nobody's doing anything in East, East Central, or North, they're just going to move.
They will certainly do that, and in our first document, we identified that very factor. Even as we began our first embryonic assault on them out there, we identified that they were fleeing to East Central environments, and very quickly we began to communicate with the cops up there on the shifts, and they began to hammer them in the same way. And fortunately, about that time, the city finally created the street narcotics team, and then we in Patrol East and South were able to target for these people. They would come to our precincts and say, what do you got cooking today? And we could give them a list of 5, 8, 10 people to go and do that quickly.
One area that we haven't mentioned is the North End. You know, if people get addicted to crack, it's not going to make a lot of difference where they live. And in fact, they might like to buy it closer to home.
That's right.
Do you see signs of a movement in the rock houses northward?
Yes. The first indicators we got were crooks from the North End. We would identify them as we encountered them in these places that were out there to buy and use crack cocaine. And of course, the entrepreneur in these people, it wasn't long before, and as a matter of fact, this very month, I got an indicator from a North End officer. They seized their first crack rock form cocaine out there at a place where they've had a lot of car prowls, and they've known that the loot was going into this place. So it is, as I say, such a phenomenal and effective means of abuse of cocaine that it's going to go everywhere in time.
The Seattle City Council has been studying the possibility of changing the basic thrust of operation of the narcotics unit, or making some suggestions to the Seattle Police Department. Right. Whether you stay with that department or not, I realize you're trying to make that decision right now as to whether you go back on active duty after the reprimand from the chief over the operations in the South End. What do you think has to be done? Is the City Council going in the right direction? What has to happen in this city?
Yeah, I think that the City Council has emerged as a factor where it was not before, interpreting community concerns and asking specific questions. I think the hearings last Tuesday, a week back there, were an indicator that at last some really specific indicators of the problem and the community's concern have surfaced. And that's invaluable in the process.
Doesn't there have to be something more than just officers pounding on doors? I mean, there are communities outside Seattle. King County surrounds us. There's Bellevue, there's Mercer Island, there's South King County. Is the task just, let's get this out of Seattle and let somebody else worry about it?
No. And while we have indicated that there is this mobility, we've never suggested that it was worthwhile or worthy of our agency to just drive this problem into the county. There has to be effective liaison with the other agencies that can capitalize on what we've done and what we've learned. And that's a two-way street. Very often the outlying agencies know things that we need to dial into our equation. It is going to be a regional problem, as all other forms of drug abuse are. Already we see the crooks with the main package of dope have their little satellite locations in South King County, where they see a little less police presence because the county is spread more thinly. We have delivered some informants to county. We have dealt with them in our mutual problems, and I think that has to go on.
You know, Elliot Ness tried this in Prohibition, and a lot of other people were out there smashing stills and making life very difficult for people who either made gin in their bathtubs or in Seattle actually had basements cut out under lawns with ways to get into this sealed-off area. It didn't work. What makes you think this will work this time?
Well, I think what you have to assess is whether or not, given that there is a human proclivity to get loaded, we are a chemical society and we're always going to be that way, whether or not you can distinguish that some chemicals are more harmful than others, and then take a realistic stance that at least minimizes the exposure of your society. If, for instance, we change the drinking age to 14, with all of the alcoholism problems we have in this society, you would see with that new tolerance an incredible upsurge, because children are very, very vulnerable to alcohol and its effects at that time. By the same token, people of all ages are enormously susceptible to the impact of cocaine, and so yes, we do have to fight that battle, even though we will never fully win it. We have got, as these chemicals come along, to confront them, define them, and then make an educated decision on how we're going to deal with them.
As a person who tried this, got slapped on the wrist, or perhaps a little bit harder than that, and told, from now on, you're going to sit in the basement of the police department in communications. Have you ever said, to heck with it? It ain't worth it, personally, to fight this? I'm just going to give up and get up?
No, what I see, even though I feel my days are done at SPD, or just about, I have a great sense of satisfaction. When we set sail a year ago, January, there was no effort, and that's well identified. There was no effective effort in the Seattle Police Department. And even the recent narcotics commanders will confirm this if you ask them privately, that what we did set the stage, the creation of teams in the 2 precincts, as we suggested, and they finally found the wherewithal to put a street narcotics team, which has been very successful out there as a support unit to traditional narcotics efforts and also the street teams. I have a real sense of accomplishment about those things, and I share it with people that, like me, also won't be rewarded or identified in traditional terms. You're not going to see them chiseling my name over the front door of the Public Safety Building very soon.
Sergeant Chuck Pillon, thank you for joining me, and thank you for watching Viewpoint on the News.